The beginning of June 1943, Railroad Street, Mexico City, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly in the hand of non-commissioned officer Ferrer Burkhart as he wrote down in his secret diary the words that could have cost him solitary confinement if they had been discovered by his own officers. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation can have such abundance, fighting on two fronts. From the train window, he had just seen something that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights burned on every farm, on every street corner, in every shop window. An endless constellation of electricity stretched over the Texas plains at 10 o'clock in the evening. In Germany, blackout regulations have plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification barely reached 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps got off the passenger train. Not boxcars, not cargo platforms, but soft Pullman cars with dining cars and sleeping shelves. The entire population of Mexico City came out to see their arrival. None of them knew that this moment would provoke the most profound psychological transformation in the modern history of prisoners of war. The systematic demolition of Nazi ideology by a pure demonstration of American industrial potential. The mathematics of Allied victory was recorded not in battle plans, but in production statistics, which would soon destroy all the ideas that these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse began on May 13, 1943, in Tunis. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, surrendered along with about 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as the scattered units continued to surrender for several days. The most experienced Wehrmacht fighters in the desert, the people who drove the British back to Egypt, who earned the involuntary respect of Montgomery himself, suddenly became prisoners. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Rodke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the French campaign, twice wounded in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, will provide historians with the most detailed description of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria. As Rodke and 30,000 other prisoners of war waited in makeshift camps aboard transport ships, American efficiency was already beginning to erode their preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners every day with an organizational precision that surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had achieved even at the peak of its power. The ID cards have been photographed and archived. The medical examinations are completed. The vaccinations are done. The rights of the Geneva Convention are explained in impeccable German by American officers who have been specially trained for this moment. But the first real shock came with the food. Chief Corporal Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, "In a cage in Oran, while we were waiting for the ships, the Americans fed us better than we ate during the 6 months of the Desert War. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize that this was their standard military ration."
The Liberty-class transport ships that were supposed to transport them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial might. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, a fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known about it. These vessels, which were being produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, returned after delivering supplies to the European theater of operations. Instead of sailing back empty, They were carrying a human cargo of up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month by the summer of 1943. A two-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of psychological destruction. Sergeant Major Kurt Zimmerman of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed report, which was preserved in letters to his family after repatriation. The ship's crew, he noted, was throwing out more food waste every day than his entire company had received in weekly rations in recent months in Africa. American sailors were throwing away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had stood too long, Zimmerman wrote. They did it openly, thoughtlessly, not to tease us, but because this waste meant nothing to them. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classes for the study of American power. The prisoners of war discovered that the ship carrying them was one of 2,710 Liberty ships to be built during the war. Each of them required 250,000 parts, assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, they learned from talkative American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders, which were then assembled in ports that barely existed 2 years ago. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since the time of Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotate over the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited numbers, was standard equipment on a cargo ship. It was then that I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first kind of America destroyed the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled over 4,300 acres, its docks stretched for miles, its cranes loaded and unloaded dozens of ships at the same time. In one day, this single port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Corporal Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his enlistment, counted 47 cargo ships at various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have acquired dozens of men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric force, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that suffocated their industrial cities. The prisoners were lined up in columns to march to the waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots filled with civilian vehicles, hundreds of them belonging to harbor workers. In Germany, private car ownership remained the privilege of the rich and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary workers traveled to work in their own cars. But nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. Not freight wagons, not the 40 and 8 wagons that transported German troops across Europe, but full passenger wagons, Pullman cars with upholstered seats that turned into sleeping places, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Hauptmann Radke wrote, "We boarded as tourists, not as prisoners." The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioner in their carriage was not working properly. Conditioner. In August, they believed that such luxury existed only on Hitler's private train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma was bound to prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, watching America, which could not exist according to everything they were told. Every small town was ablaze with lighting. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would be lucky to have one electric street lamp, showed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in several rooms. Trains passed factories working the night shift, their windows lit up, parking lots full even at midnight. Chief Corporal Muller, whose father was a block leader of the Nazi Party in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We drove through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than in the whole of Hamburg. The guards told us that it was normal that every American city had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged his shoulders and said, we'd see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for refueling with water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railroad workers completed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automatic coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority. Even more alarming was the accidental wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German worker 2 months' salary. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empty ones into the trash thoughtlessly. They smoked cigarettes continuously, putting them out half-smoked. Feldwebel Muller, an electrical engineer at Siemens before the war, estimated that the single railway yard they stopped at used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire neighborhood in Berlin used in a day. The extravagance was magnificent, he wrote. They left the lights on in empty buildings. Electric fans were running in the spare rooms. It was the insouciance of an endless resource. As the trains crossed Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial might in full force. Through the windows, they could see endless factories, each one bigger than anything most people had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, trains slowed as they passed the Robertstown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had grown out of empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing this process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Chief Lieutenant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, immediately understood the consequences. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew these factories. I've seen distillation columns, catalytic crackers. Each structure was more advanced than anything we had built. And there were 4 of them in this one place alone. We were told that there are dozens more across the country." The trains passed the Ford Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At the peak of production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant occupied 2.5 million square feet of space and used more electricity than the entire city of Cologne. Hauptmann Verli, the Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they drove by. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. "We were told that American planes were inferior, hastily built, and would fall apart in battle. But I saw the precision of the assembly lines and the quality of the design. These were not defective planes. They were just built faster than we could have imagined."
The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete the destruction of Nazi mythology became. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while underneath them the barges were carrying more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each holding enough wheat to feed a German city for several months. Non-commissioned officer Carl Schmidt, the son of a farmer from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food like we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without worrying about losses. I watched as they loaded one barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive cattle yard where tens of thousands of cattle were waiting to be slaughtered. The smell of meat processing plants filled the air for miles. German prisoners of war who lived on 200 grams of meat a week in Africa, when they were lucky, watched American workers eat beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Corporal Paul Fisher. No, that's not right. They ate meat the way we would like to eat bread. The guard bought them hamburgers from a stall near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them, without hesitation, paid with $1 bill. It wasn't anything special. It was their usual meal. Arriving at the camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive disruption.
Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that surpassed what most of them knew as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric light, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building was built using more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital amazed the medical staff among the prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in an institution better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that have been unavailable in Germany since 1941. All of these are standard supplies for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer later testified. It's a miracle drug that we've only heard rumors about. They used it freely even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying from a lack of basic sulfamide drugs, and the Americans gave us the most advanced medicine without hesitation. Camp cuisine has become another class for studying American prosperity. The prisoners assigned to kitchen duties discovered refrigerator closets, electric mixers, automatic dishwashers, and gas stoves that could cook food for 5,000 people. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians had not seen since 1939. Sergeant Major Otto Kraups, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, but just excess. American regulations require that we cook 10% more than necessary to ensure that every prisoner gets a full ration. The excess is thrown away. I cried when I threw absolutely good bread in the trash." By September 1943, the shortage of labor in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners of war in fields and factories throughout the country. This decision, necessitated by necessity, was bound to prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could achieve. Groups of prisoners were transported daily by trucks to their workplaces, traveling through the American countryside without bandages or limited routes. They saw everything: endless fields of corn and wheat, factories working in 3 shifts, shops full of goods, parking lots full of cars, houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, non-commissioned officer Herbert Lang watched as one machine processed more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could process in a month using traditional methods. The plant was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that provided electricity to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the factory wasn't anyone special, Lang wrote. Not an aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. However, he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including blacks, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And that was okay. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in beet fields, observing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. One combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 people. The fields stretched to the horizon, each of which was larger than entire German counties. Farmers were casually talking about harvests that would be fantastic in Germany, 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared to 30 in Germany on the best land. Corporal Willem Hoffman, who worked on the farm behind Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a 16-year-old boy, drove a tractor that cost more than everything my father earned in his life. When I mentioned it, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a very good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better." The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. Although the rules of the Geneva Convention prohibited direct work in military production, prisoners of war could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This formality allowed thousands of German prisoners to see American industrial power with their own eyes. At the Campbell Soup plant in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines that processed more tomatoes in one day than most German factories processed in a month. The facility operated with a minimal number of women and elderly men, as most of the young workers were in the army. Nevertheless, production exceeded the pre-war level. Staff Sergeant Ernst Wagner, who worked at a German food processing plant before the war, documented this experience. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans at the same time. One elderly woman oversaw management that would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did it by listening to the radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant saw glimpses of the automotive industry's transition to military production. The River Rouge complex, visible through the water, employed 100,000 workers, producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatt-hours of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. "We saw parking lots," wrote Chief Corporal Franz Kellner. "Thousands of cars owned by workers. A worker in Germany? Even our officers rarely owned cars. Factory workers went to work here. The guard told us that many workers owned 2 cars, one for work and the other for family use. We thought he was bullying us." By the winter of 1943, the combined effects of these observations were causing what American intelligence officers called an ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Attorney General's office, has documented an increase in the number of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring group, reported in December 1943, "Prisoners no longer argue when they are shown production statistics. They've seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have fallen silent. They still remain loyal to Germany, but they no longer talk about victory. Many openly question what they've been told about America." Camp newspapers, published by the prisoners themselves, began to reflect this transformation. Der Ruf, published in Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to a discussion of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censorship, "We were told that America is a mixed nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day that I'm here, I see the opposite. It is the most organized, united, and powerful nation on earth. Criminals told us fairy tales." The most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected direction: the attitude towards Italian prisoners after the surrender of Italy in September 1943. The Italian prisoners of war who agreed to cooperate were integrated into Italian service units, given better accommodations, higher pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched as their former allies worked side by side with Americans, ate in American restaurants, and some even dated American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, but they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, and send parcels home. Americans don't hate them. This democracy which we have been taught to despise seems more noble than our own system." Christmas of 1943 had the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and community groups have sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners of war, the enemies who tried to kill American soldiers a few months ago. Each package contained cigarettes, candies, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, although the rules forbade most to accept. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. The women from Hearn sent homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness towards the enemies destroyed the last remnants of the Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother was killed in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know that we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies. Nevertheless, they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but sincere kindness." What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those who are absolutely confident of victory and unwavering in their might. The Christmas feast itself was incomprehensible. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. The amount of food that Germany has not seen since the First World War. The prisoners ate until they got sick, unable to understand that such resources were being wasted on the enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote Sergeant Major Hans Sauer. "Better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." And it wasn't anything special. The guards told us that it was an ordinary American Christmas dinner, that every American family eats the same food. If they can feed the prisoners in this way, what should their own soldiers eat? By the beginning of 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners had been enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and science. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University has sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. The prisoners who were told that Americans were uncultural barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, and scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple points of view, which was impossible in Nazi Germany. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist called up from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They talked about science as universal, belonging to all mankind. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared their knowledge with their enemies." This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to the minds shaped by the Nazi ideology.
American films were shown in the camp theaters, not propaganda, but ordinary Hollywood productions. The prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing an image of American defeat and recovery that echoed their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, surprised that Americans showed such self-criticism to their enemies. "They're not hiding anything," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. However, this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. It's considered patriotic here." The spring of 1944 brought expanded prisoner of war labor programs as American production reached its peak. German prisoners of war worked in canneries, mills, and manufacturing plants, witnessing the full power of American industrial potential. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could refute. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners were unloading steel that was to become amphibious ships for the Normandy landings. They watched as workers assembled 700 boats a month, each requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women, who operated cranes, welded housings, and ran production lines. Staff Sergeant Kurt Zimmerman wrote, "Women doing men's work, blacks operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. However, production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire fleet built in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces were running continuously, powered by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak. "I worked at Krupp before the war," wrote Chief Corporal Paul Hartman. "I thought I understood industrial production, but it was beyond imagination. They were losing more steel in this spill than we could produce through slave labor and double shifts. The workers complained about overtime, producing quantities that we could not achieve through slave labor and double shifts." The harvest of the summer of 1944 ensured the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoner of war worked in the Midwest, overseeing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they observed wheat harvests where individual farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. The harvesters moved through the fields like ships on an ocean of gold, each harvesting 100 acres a day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Non-commissioned officer Franz Weber, the son of an East Prussian farmer, wrote, "One American farmer with machines does the work of 100 German farmers." They showed me aerial photographs of wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half of their harvest and still have more than the whole of Europe combined. In the Central Valley of California, prisoners were picking fruits in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They observed how perfectly good fruits were discarded due to minor defects, fruits that would be appreciated in Germany. Whole crops were sometimes plowed to maintain prices, a concept that caused a psychological breakdown among prisoners from starved Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable. Mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits because there were too many of them. We begged to be allowed to send them to our families in Germany. The guards were sympathetic, but explained that this was impossible. The waste was a strategic proof of unlimited resources.
June 6, 1944. When news of the invasion of Normandy reached the camps, the German prisoners experienced their last ideological collapse. The scale of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 people in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational ability beyond the wildest dreams of Nazi Germany. The prisoners at Camp Shelby watched the newsreel of the invasion for several days. They saw endless streams of ships, artificial harbors, a supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily through open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they were told was too weak to fight. Oberlieutenant Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not only the war, but the entire Nazi project. We challenged the world's greatest industrial power with the help of fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda portraying Americans as weak and sentimental, the prisoners of war found a people confident enough in their strength to show mercy. When Corporal Hans Muller's son was killed in the bombing of Hamburg, the American camp commander personally delivered a message from the Red Cross and expressed his condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that it was difficult for her to feed their children, American church groups sent her food parcels to Germany, enemy civilians, in a nation that America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, Hauptmann Otto wrote. They said they were fighting Hitler, not the Germans. This difference, which seemed to be propaganda, turned out to be genuine. They were preparing us for the reconstruction of Germany after the war, not for its destruction. The prisoners were particularly affected by the medical treatment. German doctors worked side by side with American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. The prisoners received surgeries that would have been available only to the elite in Germany. Psychiatric treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to injured soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity towards enemies has revealed a power we never understood, the certainty of true might." By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. More than 25,000 prisoners volunteered for democracy courses. The camp's newspapers published articles about constitutional rule, free markets, and civil rights. The discussion groups discussed the future of Germany after the war. The success of the program exceeded all expectations. The prisoners who arrived as fanatical Nazis wrote essays about democratic reconstruction. The officers who swore oaths to Hitler planned how to introduce American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. We became missionaries of democracy, admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarshal, in an interview in 1975. Not through coercion or propaganda, but through surveillance. We have seen that it works. We saw how ordinary people live better than the German aristocracy. We wanted this for Germany. The transformation was so complete that the American authorities worried that the prisoners were too inspired by American customs. Some asked to stay in America after the end of hostilities. Others married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands eventually immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. April 1945 brought the last revelation. When American troops liberated concentration camps in Germany, newsreels were shown to German prisoners of war. Many initially refused to believe it, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had retained some pride in German honor despite the military defeat were now facing the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they fought for was not just defeated, but also evil.
Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We have discovered that we are the tools of criminals. We believed that we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We discovered that we were the barbarians. The Americans, whom we called weak and decadent, showed us what civilization really means. When the hostilities ended in May 1945, German prisoners of war faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They witnessed an America that contradicted everything they believed in. They ate better as prisoners than as soldiers. They were treated with more dignity by their enemies than their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing to return to the devastated Germany. The American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political guidance. The prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was announced, realizing that America would rebuild, not punish, Germany. They were preparing us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tauben. They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They turned the defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity on the part of the victors was incomprehensible to the minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners of war were repatriated from American camps. They returned to Germany divided, destroyed, and impoverished. But they brought with them something precious: knowledge about how a democratic industrial society functions. German prisoners of war who survived American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They saw industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew that recovery was possible because they witnessed a society that had achieved this. Many former prisoners of war achieved a prominent position in the reconstruction of West Germany. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Halsking, who taught at the Korma camp, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Wechmar, who was held in the Herne camp, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on the knowledge gained in American prison camps. We have learned that prosperity comes from freedom, not from conquest, wrote Hans Kroll in his memoirs. We have seen that democracy creates wealth, that diversity brings strength, and that treating workers well increases production. These lessons learned in captivity shaped the new Germany. Historians have called the experience of German prisoners of war in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history.
Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy turned hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program was successful because it relied not on words, but on observation. The prisoners saw American society functioning at the peak of efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed the industrial potential that made German manufacturing look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading historian of German prisoners of war in America, concluded, America won the propaganda war not because of clever messages, but because of pure reality. Every hearty meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners of war were converted by prosperity.
Statistics confirm this assessment. Of the 371,683 German prisoners of war held in America, less than 1% tried to escape, while only 2,222 attempts were registered. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most notably, thousands corresponded with American families decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, the surviving German prisoners of war held a meeting in Austin, Texas. More than 500 former prisoners returned to America. Many brought their families to show them where their transformation began. Former Lance Corporal Hans Weise, who was held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a doctor in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the meeting. Life in the camps was a huge improvement for many of us who grew up in cold water apartments in Germany. We found running water, central heating, and plentiful food. But more than that, we have discovered dignity. Former Staff Sergeant Kurt Mayer, who worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young people far from home. They shared their food, their knowledge, and sometimes their homes. This humanity comes from people whose sons fought against us. It changed us forever." At a gala dinner in 1985, former Oberstleutnant Hermann Gutz, then 78 years old, delivered the main speech that captured the essence of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in lies. We left as friends, as Democrats, as people who saw the truth. America has shown us that power comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We have witnessed the arsenal of democracy in full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built weapons of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We have learned that America's true weapons are not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible creativity and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could thrive through peace rather than war. Germany, which rose from the ashes, was built on the lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as disciples. America, from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way." The audience exploded with a standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies, united in recognizing a transformation that seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June of 1943. The scale of the experience of German prisoners of war in America can be measured by clear statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success.
Camp infrastructure. More than 500 camps in 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps with 325 branches. Camps built to accommodate from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Construction is completed in an average of 90 days per camp. Prisoner population. 371,683 German prisoners of war, part of 425,871 of the total number of Axis prisoners. The peak population was in May of 1945. On average, 20,000 new arrivals a month in 1943, 30,000 a month after the Normandy landings, 60,000 a month in the last months of the war. Labor contribution: 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million plank feet of processed wood, $230 million in labor costs at the exchange rate of 1940, 80 cents daily salary per prisoner. The prisoners filled a critical labor shortage in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 2,222 escape attempts out of more than 371,000 prisoners, 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. Most of the escapees were caught within 24 hours. Not a single American civilian was injured by the escaped prisoners of war. Educational programs: more than 40,000 enrolled in educational courses, 135 camp newspapers were published, 30,000 attended English lessons, 15,000 received vocational training, university correspondence courses for 8,000. Post-war immigration: approximately 5,000 former prisoners of war immigrated to the United States after the war. More than 12,000 corresponded with American families. The average length of correspondence is 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. Rating of the appeal: 95% rated the appeal as good or excellent. 74% believed that captivity had positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in studying democracy. Less than 10% retained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The German prisoners of war who experienced American industrial might did not just witness history, they were transformed by her. Their captivity became an education, their defeat was enlightenment, and their imprisonment was a liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. After all, America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity achieved what the armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. The prisoners of war arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial power was not just overwhelming, she was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and tyranny. The trains that brought them to captivity in 1943 were carrying soldiers of the Third Reich. The ships that brought them back to Germany in 1946 were carrying the architects of democracy. They saw the future, and it worked. Their story bears witness to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not military might, but simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's ability to create abundance. The German prisoners of war were shocked by American industrial might, but they were eventually converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of the post-war redemption of Europe and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses of what free societies can achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on the foundations laid in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity comes not from conquest, but from freedom, not from racial superiority, but from human dignity, not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. German prisoners of war arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they found an industrial colossus of unlimited power and amazing humanity. They came as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. In their reverence for American abundance lay the psychological seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany. They've seen America, and they'll never be the same. Their children will grow up in a democratic Germany in alliance with the United States. A partnership built on the transformation that began when 1,850 veterans of the Africa Corps got off a train in Mexico City, Texas, and discovered that everything they believed in was wrong. The story of German prisoners of war in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became unwitting ambassadors of democracy. bringing back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would blossom into one of the most successful recoveries in history. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, achieved not by force, but by overwhelming proof of what free people can achieve when they work together. After all, this was America's secret weapon, not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the ability to turn enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German prisoners of war were shocked by American industrial power, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in this change lay the foundation for a better world.